Greetings from Helsinki, and thank you for inviting me. I'm enjoying this very much, and I'm looking forward to also the rest of the presentations very much. I started about a year ago working on my small postdoc project on Kurdish language activism in Turkey. So I'm fairly new in this, and I'm not a linguist. My background is in Middle Eastern studies, and my PhD thesis was on Turkish nationalism and how the Kurdish cultural demands have been discussed in Turkey. So this is a move to a different field, and it's very interesting, but I'm a bit uncertain to where I am at and what is relevant and what is not. So I'm really looking forward to all comments and questions. And I'm already getting some ideas of how I could present some of the arguments better in light of these previous presentations. But so the topic is Kurdish language, situation of Kurdish language in Turkey and language shift, and what is being done about to counter the language shift. And the content is I will start with saying a few words about what we know of the language shift. Then the bulk will be the efforts or the activities to counter the language shift or to reverse the language shift. And then in the end, I will say a few words about the results and the future of these activities, or the even future of Kurdish in Turkey. And my own research is mainly on language education and language education activities, and a lot of it is based on interviews and informal discussions with representatives of various organizations and individual intellectuals that I have chosen to label language activists. Another term could be language authorities. But so I will start with the language shift, and I don't know, I will try to be very brief with this because I think most of you know the background already. But so it's in Turkey, it's difficult to obtain solid statistical data because the state has been very determinedly monolingual. It has not collected information on the mother tongue of the population since 1965. So often it's sort of anecdotal that when language shift is discussed, is that you hardly ever hear Kurdish spoken in Diyarbakır, because we don't really know for sure how many people used to speak Kurdish and then how many people speak it now, and then what is their level of fluency. A groundbreaking study in this regard was, I think most of you probably know it, was the Konda study conducted in 2006, where about 13% of the respondents, and the sample was very big, stated that Kurdish or Zaza is their mother tongue, and 10% of the respondents said that it's a language they use daily. So some people chose it as mother tongue but did not use it daily. And then also 9% of the respondents that chose Kurdish or Zaza as their identity chose Turkish as their mother tongue. So a language shift had taken place. Some of the more recent data is from two surveys made by the Ravest survey company based in Diyarbakır. And according to them, almost 80% of Kurdish parents consider themselves fluent in Kurdish, but only 24% use Kurdish as the main language in communication with their children. So the parents know Kurdish, but don't really teach it so much to their kids. And this is an enormous rate of language shift that is taking place here, disruption in intergenerational transmission. And so it's not a surprise then that less than half of urban Kurdish youth consider themselves fluent in Kurdish. And that's also from last year, so a current study, but with a relatively small sample. And of course, these are self-assessments, so we don't know what this fluency actually refers to. But so when you look at this little data we have, when one thinks that should Kurdish be considered a threatened language? Yes, because there is a serious disruption of intergenerational transmission, which in sort of the literature of language shift in Fishman's scale, it's stage 6, and long-term survival of language depends on whether this can be ensured. And then there are also some smaller studies of this language shift with small samples, and one of them is by Handan Çağlayan from 2014, and she discovered that there is an intergenerational shift, which I think, I mean, in the literature I've read elsewhere, I've seen it mainly in migrant communities, or it's been discussed in relation to migrant communities, so that the grandparents are monolingual in one language, parents are bilingual, and then the children are monolingual in the other language. So here it's, of course, Kurdish and Turkish. So Kurdish can be considered a threatened language, but of course, the language activists I spoke with were not overly concerned yet, because there are still very many speakers, young speakers, large communities, and then also there are Kurmanji speakers, both in Syria and Iraq. Of course, Zaza is a bit different because the community is smaller and it's not really spoken outside of Turkey. And then, of course, there are language maintenance activities. So there are activities to counter this shift. So it's not that everybody's just sitting and waiting for it to happen. And here's just a very short, I will skip most of it, just about the timeline, that actually the emphasis on language and culture is relatively recent. I mean, the Kurdish movement, and the Kurdish movement in a very wide sense, did not emphasize them as main aims before, but new both organizational and other dynamism only emerged in the 2000s, really. Before that, the Kurdish cultural sphere was very limited. And as a loosely organized language movement, it started actually from 2006 onwards. And then there was something I've labeled auspicious circle, starting from the Kurdish opening and finishing with the collapse of the peace talks between the PKK and the state in 2015, after which a lot of the advances were cancelled and extreme repression of language activities was restarted, so that the organizational scene has only been recovering from that in late 2018 and 2019. And when one looks at efforts to reverse language shift or language maintenance activities, a lot of things have obviously happened in Turkey. So there have been mass campaigns for legal changes and for mother tongue education. There are over 20 publishing houses that publish Kurdish literature and other Kurdish works. There are television and broadcasting, and also Kurdish has become very much used in local administration, politics, etc. And an important sphere is Kurdish language education, which is what I look in my research, which, as I said, is very much based on interviews with language activists. And also maybe the focus is on a bit on the role played by civil society and civil society organizations. And of course, the most in long-term activity have been adult education Kurdish language courses, which have been offered by a multitude of organizations over the years, and they have reached tens of thousands of people. So tens of thousands of participants have either learned their mother tongue as an adult, or they learned to read and write their mother tongue. And because the scale has been so large, this has brought a lot of how would I say, benefits when one looks at reversing language shift, because of course one aim is to increase the number of speakers, and it's also very important to increase number of young speakers, so speakers who are in the childbearing age, and most of the participants have been either students or university students or young professionals. And then by increasing the number of people who can read in Kurdish, you also create a new public for the publishing companies and Kurdish language publications. So the publishing houses can sell them because people read them. And then they have also contributed to having a pool of people who have good Kurdish skills who can then enter university Kurdish programs. And then also they have been a way to recruit more activists into the language movement, because these organizations mostly work on volunteer basis with very small funding. So they need the volunteers, and most of the volunteer teachers are graduates from the programs of the organizations themselves. So this has been a very influential way for the community and for the activists to work to reverse the language shift. Another important development has been the development of Kurdish studies in Turkey. So by now, Kurdish studies are in 7 universities. And of course, this has a huge practical and symbolic importance. I mean, practical in the sense that Kurdish as a language is being studied more, be researched more, and there are publications of Kurdish and in Kurdish. And you produce more experts on the language. And then, of course, there's a symbolic importance of Kurdish being used in yet another high domain or formal public register. So academia and scholarship happens now also in Kurdish, because it's possible to submit one's master thesis in Kurdish. There have been a lot of difficulties on the way, because the Ministry of Education has refused to hire the graduates as teachers of Kurdish for the elective courses at schools, and also teachers and scholars have been fired by the decree laws. So it has not been an easy going, but it is very important for the continuation of Kurdish in Turkey. And I mean, it's kind of sad, but also just to think that the symbolic importance is also about it finally having been proven in Turkey that Kurdish is a real language, that it's a proper language and not a degenerate mixture of Persian and Arabic, as was claimed by the Turkish nationalists. Because if it's taught at university, I mean, it obviously is a proper language. And then the third sphere is elective Kurdish classes at schools. So they were started in 2012 from 5th to 8th grade, 2 hours a week. Once again, it's difficult to find the most recent numbers of how many students there are, but not very many. The last figures that were published, I think, were for 2015 and 16, and there were only 77,000 students who had chosen Kurdish, either Kurmanji or Zaza. And when one looks at the current print runs of the primers, it's probably even less nowadays, probably about 60,000 or less for Kurmanji, and of Zaza, I don't know. When one considers that there are probably more than 15 million Kurds in Turkey, and that the estimation is that in 2010, 2 million children participated to the school boycott demanding mother tongue education. So now that there is some classes in Kurdish, okay, from 5th grade to 8th, 2 hours a week, it's not very much, but why aren't they choosing it? And the explanations I was given by the language activists was that there's a lot of bureaucratic and administrative hindrance. So this is yet again one of those rights that is given, but in practice, there are a lot of hurdles. So the schools don't offer the classes, even though there are enough students who want them. The parents are advised to choose something more proper, or then because the Ministry of Education didn't hire the graduates from the Kurdish programs at university as teachers, there are no teachers, so you can't have the classes. Another explanation was given as the poor image, low status, and limited functionality of Kurdish. Parents, when they choose the electives, they want something that helps the kid to get into a university and find employment, and they don't maybe consider Kurdish as useful in that sense. And then one criticism was the lack of interest on the part of the political movement, because even though it's only 2 hours a week by now, many of the language activists thought that even this much or this little of Kurdish education could bring a lot of benefits, because if you had more people who would select it, then you could it would legitimize it. If you can study at school, you can also talk it in the hallway of school. And then if you have a lot of students, then there will be more teachers hired. And if you have a lot of students, then maybe in the future you can say, this is what we want, give us more. And then maybe this could lead to a mother tongue education. But the idea, the view of many of the language activists, not all, was that the political movement is too strict in its ambitions. It only wants mother tongue, Kurdish as mother tongue, or nothing. And then also that at the same time, they don't think about the practicality of the issue and the language shift. For them, Kurdish is a symbolic part of identity. I mean, not a functional tool of communication. And they are already too Turkish. I mean, they use mostly Turkish in the political speeches, which also was the criticism directed towards a lot of the other, how would I say, active people, artists, etc., who sing in Kurdish, but then when they're off stage, they resort to Turkish because their Turkish is stronger. But so then when one looks at the results of these language maintenance activities or efforts to reverse the language shift, so on the plus side, first of all, this is community involvement, because studies on language shift and countering language shift emphasize how important it is that the community itself works on it. Because if it's from above, which also in Turkey is not going to happen, it's not going to happen. Then a good side is the increased use of Kurdish in public domains, because that's considered very necessary in Turkey, where the language shift is not due to simple hierarchization of majority and minority language, but really active repression by the state apparatus. And then, of course, this emphasis on language and all these activities have managed to create a new Kurdish-speaking and writing elite, which is very important for the future of these language activities also. But of course, in the minus side is that the use of Kurdish in the private domain has not increased or is decreasing, and there is this disruption in this intergenerational transmission. So you almost never hear Kurdish spoken in Diyarbakır. How do I go back here? And a few words on future. So the big question, of course, is how to ensure the long-term survival of Kurdish in Turkey. And I'm totally unable to answer that, but two things the activists quite often emphasized. One is obligatory Kurdish mother tongue education at schools. Obligatory, so people have to opt out, not opt in. And so this is kind of what Christopher said a bit before about bilingual education being needed, because otherwise some kids are disadvantaged. I think that's becoming less and less of a problem. It's because for a lot of the kids, their Turkish is stronger already when they enter school. So bilingual education is needed to retain the two languages for the situation to remain multilingual. And then another rather obvious point was the limits of what can be achieved with language activism, because the language movement is fairly large, but it's not a mass movement. And for it to be effective, they will need the help of political parties and other means of turning it into a mass movement to counter the language shift in the private domain. Thank you very much. That was all. And any suggestions on future sort of avenues of research and possible sources of further data, I mean, I will appreciate them very much. Please contact me, I mean, either now or later. Thank you.